When we assign my number to the value 5, we see that things work just perfectly. The computer runs line 1, creates my number and gives it the value 5, then runs line 2, which says to print my number. When it says to print my number, it goes and looks up the value of my number and finds out that it's 5, and basically replaces my number with the value 5. Print 5 results in 5 being printed to the console. So when we set the variable equal to the value, things work just fine. Our code then continues to run though, and on line 3, it attempts to set the value 5 equal to the variable my number. That's not going to work. And so the error we get is this syntax error. The explanation is can't assign to literal. Literal is Python's word for something like 5, just a pure value. We can only assign to variables, not to values or not to literals. We can see this happen in other ways too. We also can't assign values to one another or set other kinds of values equal to variables. So here when the computer runs line 1, it attempts to set 3 equal to 5. Doing so would break the universe, and so Python tells us that we have a syntax error, and Python gives us the same explanation. We still can't assign to a literal. The fact that Python hit an error on line 1 means that it never actually gets to line 2. When Python hits an error, it quits right there and doesn't continue trying to run the code, unless we handle the error, but we'll talk about that at the end of Unit 3. The other rule that we've discussed is that we can't use variables before they've been assigned values. This is actually an easier problem to avoid in Python than in many other languages, because in Python we generally create the variable by assigning it a value in the first place. You can't really create a variable without assigning it a value. When the computer runs line 1, it creates the variable my number and gives it the value 5. It has no way of creating it without giving it a value. However, there are a couple ways we can accidentally try to use variables that don't yet have values. For example, here we've just removed that assignment statement. When the computer runs line 1, it tries to print what I'm calling my unassigned number. The name of it kind of gives it away. I haven't assigned it to anything yet. You also might notice it's not highlighted in blue. That's because it hasn't been created or defined as a variable. Right now it's just text. So when Python tries to print that, it triggers an error. Specifically, it triggers a name error. And it describes that the name my unassigned number is not defined, which is exactly the problem we were demonstrating. We can't print a variable before we've assigned it a value. So if you accidentally use a variable name before you've actually created it, this is the error that you'll see. This can happen for a number of reasons you might not expect. For example, if you misspell a variable name, you might encounter this error because the misspelled version hasn't been created yet. Or if you capitalize a variable name differently in one place than the other, you might get this error because the capitalized version hasn't been created yet. We can look at the variable names and pretty immediately see that one is just a misspelled version of the other, but the computer has no way of knowing that. It's also possible to manually create a variable without a value. We do that by setting it equal to the word none. Notice here that the word none is red and bold, which is how we format words for which Python has special meaning. Python attaches special meaning to the word none. It's basically like a null value. It creates the variable, but intentionally gives it no value. Interestingly though, using a variable to which we've explicitly assigned no value works differently than using a variable that just hasn't been declared yet at all. When the computer runs line 1, it creates my null variable and gives it the value none, or gives it no value. However, as we see on line 2, the computer is nonetheless able to print the value of my null variable. It prints none. This is similar to how it would print true or false when we assign the values true or false to some variable. When we get to line 3 though, the computer encounters the same problem. My undeclared variable has never even been defined, and so it gives us this name error. It tells us that my undeclared variable is not defined. So there's a difference between not being defined and being defined but given no value. Note though that even though my null variable has a value and can be printed, there's really very little else we can do with it.